my culture, I have a space in my community. They are sacred people who are like liaisons between the worlds of the masculine and feminine, as well as the worlds of the natural and supernatural. And we have special sacred roles in our society. And I can bring my whole self into that community. And so I love working in the population because I don't have to be fragmented. So I think we have a long way to go in how we think about class and how we think about other issues like healthcare, homelessness. And I think we need to think about how are we've allowed for too long Western and white ideas and patriarchy to define gender and sexuality for us. In Lakota culture, we have our own ideas of gender and sexuality. And I know lots of other cultures have their own ideas of gender and sexuality and what that looks like. And I think the longer we see and listen to LGBT communities, we will see this grow. You see now all different kinds of gender identities. And some of those are cultural, some of those are created. And we need to think about that and like decolonize our gender and sexuality. We can't allow certain groups to do that. And right now in our church, we allow the church pension group and the church medical trust to do that for us. And all of our trans siblings and non-binary siblings cannot enroll authentically into the medical system and get health insurance because they're required to identify as either male or female. You don't have a non-binary option. And at our last, I know Trans Episcopal, which is a group, they put forward some sample resolutions for dioceses to pass. And in South Dakota, Diocese of South Dakota, which I think people like to think of us as one of the square states and all of the things that people stereotype about the Midwest and rural areas. In the Diocese of South Dakota, which has a majority people of color in our diocese, we're about 70% people of color, we passed all 4 of those resolutions. And the only people who voted against them were white folks from a very conservative congregation. And I say that and tell you that because for us as Indian people and for us in South Dakota, it's all about relationships. And I think Dawn talked about how we move from outreach to engagement. And I think as Indian people, it's all about relationships. I think as community of color or as folks from collectivistic society, everything comes back down to relationships and those things. And so how are we thinking about and engaging in those relationship building? That will help us pass those resolutions. And I know if we can do it in South Dakota, other folks can. But one of those resolutions calls on the Secretary of the Diocesan Convention to send that resolution to Church Pension Group and the Episcopal Church Medical Trust, asking them to change that policy about having only 2 genders listed on the form when you and there's other stuff I have on here that I could talk about, but I think that was just like a good place to kind of lead in and begin. And I think we have our other, yay, okay. I was just
welcome. So Daniel, if you want to just introduce yourself and tell us a bit about the organization here in DC and then particularly about LGBTQIA teens, youth.
Absolutely. I am Daniel Rico. I'm the Director of Development at Sasha Bruce Youth Work, an organization here in the District of Columbia, really focusing on youth homelessness. We are the operator of the only homeless shelter for minors in the district. So we really play a critical role in the effort to end youth homelessness in the city. So before I kind of share a little bit more about the work of the organization, I'd like to share a little bit more about the individuals that we work with. And there's one particular youth that comes to mind. I met them when I was initially coming into Sasha Bruce, and I was doing a service project at the Bruce House, at the Home for Minors. And this young person came into our house, and she had been kicked out because she had come out, they had come out as trans. Their parents did not agree with them, and essentially she had nowhere to go. When they came to the Sasha Bruce house, they were very, very quiet. They were very hesitant to engage with anybody. And when I began to kind of see what they were doing, I noticed that they would spend a lot of time drawing these beautiful pictures. These pictures always involved her entire family. And when I began to talk to them, I noticed that, I noticed the families, and I asked them, why do you draw your entire family? They said, I know that they love me. I know that they might have a difficult time understanding right now, but I know that they love me. I came back the next day, and it was a complete transformation. They were engaging with other youth in the program. They preferred to actually stay with the females in the house, and they came back, and she was quickly dressed. They had done their makeup, done just her hair and everything, and it was beautiful. And what I noticed was a complete transformation and something clicked about the role of Sasha Bruce as it relates to the LGBT. Sasha Bruce provides a safe place that embraces and celebrates the diversity of all youth. And this is very important for any LGBT youth in our city. If you look at the statistics of homeless youth, roughly 40% of youth are actually identified as LGBT. So all of our priorities have always been ensuring that we create a welcoming environment for them. At Sasha Bruce, we do this in a variety of ways. We do this through our street outreach, engaging youth that just feel distrustful of existing organizations. We do this through our drop-in center, where they have a safe space. We do this through our transitional housing programs. With the onset of COVID, most of those places closed. And going back to the story about this young person that felt comfortable, felt loved in this house, all of that disappeared at the peak of the pandemic. At Sasha Bruce, we had to scale back our drop-in center, which meant that we could only accept 10 youth at a time, compared to when there were close to 70 youth at a time on any given night. So imagine how difficult it was to have a line of youth outside the door and telling them, I'm sorry, we cannot take you. They've been kicked out of their home. They have nowhere to go, and now they can't even come to safe places. And it was very difficult. And what we saw was an increase of domestic violence, an increase in substance abuse, an increase of deaths, an increase in just gun violence in general. These youth were returned back to their communities that something's about celebrate. And it's been very, very difficult for us because we see that impact of that. And we're seeing youth that we had not seen in years, that have been placed in beautiful homes that were stable, and they're coming back and they're saying, I'm homeless, I've been kicked out, or I don't have a job, I can't pay my rent. And we have a lot of cases now where youth might be staying with their families, but that conflict that has historically pushed them away is no longer being reported, it's no longer being addressed. So this is where we kind of see youth running away, sleeping on the streets, engaging in unhealthy behaviors, and it has really affected our ability. It has been very difficult to honestly come back every week and hear this particular youth has been shot. This particular youth has been overdosed. This is a very challenging period for any public provider. Whereas health, it was a focus, has now become a priority. So when we look at the continuum of care here in the District of Columbia, which essentially prioritizes the funds for various housing programs, there are 3 key areas that have emerged as priorities for the city and for us this year. One is providing safe homes for LGBT youth. The other is providing support to those violence. And finally, providing resources to the providers that bridge the healthcare, mental health, and housing component of homelessness. We have not historically addressed that. And it really has revolutionized how we approach our campaign to end poverty. So as we kind of look at what is the role of the ministry here, I go back to again to that story. Our youth are looking for that safe space where they feel loved, where they feel embraced. Many of your churches actually play a critical role in that. We might not be able to go back to full capacity, but they know that they have a safe place where they can actually turn. Church of the Epiphany is a wonderful example of that. They have opened their doors to homeless youth, homeless individuals who celebrate them as they are. They are able to bring their resources and connect to those programs. As we think about the recovery effort moving beyond COVID, these are critical elements of it to look at and ensure, particularly for LGBT youth, with so much trauma, so much neglect, so much challenges in their life, that we get to celebrate them and recreate the safe space. Because only then, when we create the safe space, can we really begin to provide the critical services and support that they need. So whether that be medical care, behavioral health, or simply a safe place to stay, we need to first create that safe space. And I think this is a critical role that we can really play.
I think what you're saying is absolutely true. I myself was homeless as a teenager when I got kicked out of the house. I had moved to Seattle and my dad was like, nope. And I actually lived in a transitional living program. I would go to church on Sunday at the cathedral, and the time that worked was the evening service, which happened to be integrity service, which I didn't know what that meant at the time, which is the LGBT service. And what was interesting, I don't think they realized I was homeless, the people at the church, but they were always friendly to me and welcoming. And I think that was important, and I appreciated that. So I think that, it's definitely something we need to think a lot about. One of the things that I think about as you were talking, and I should have mentioned earlier, was the story of the Ethiopian eunuch in the Bible and how that can be a model of who are we supposed to minister? And that was the first Gentile that was baptized. So think about who are we called to minister to? Our LGBT siblings are definitely in the population. I don't think we've shunned them way too long. We haven't thought about how we welcome them and see them as our relatives and being in right relationship.
And you brought up a really good point. That's in your own story. A lot of people didn't realize you were homeless. And I think that's the case for many individuals that are experiencing homelessness. If you're a teenager, you want to blend in. You do not want to be standing out and having people ask you all these questions. And it's very critical that we embrace every individual that we see and come to our doors. Someone beautiful, unique, as our If we share our love for them, they will share that love to us as well. And it's very important to never assume that someone's homeless, or never assume that they're, particularly during this period, it's important to realize that we're all struggling. And if we create this community, if we fulfill our mission to minister to all, we'll be able to reach this individuals. You may not see it, but you will be able to reach it.
Thank you. Are there
Questions? Yeah. You both were talking about like what it is to be multiply marginalized, or being margins of the already marginalized community. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of having, I've been using the word synergy, but it's been called like intersectional conversations around justice initiatives where, historically it's like, oh, we've got to do racial justice and then LGBTQ and then environment and then. In your understanding, especially around our LGBTQ work and in the church, how do you see us having more intersectional conversations?
I think one of the things that I think gives me an advantage, I think as a Lakota person, we tend to see the world as like one very complicated Venn diagram where almost everything's overlapped. So it's really hard. We can't tease out. I can't tease out my Lakota culture from my gender or because they're a part of who I am. And so I think in that, we have to recognize this idea of, in Lakota we would say, we are all related. And when we say we, we're not just talking about people, but about creation of plants and animals. The gospel message is, how are we called to be a good relative? And so we have to see that our liberation and our joy is also tied up in your liberation and your joy, and that's connected to the liberation of the earth, for example. And all of those pieces are very closely tied together. And I think if we can see each other as relatives rather than as othering, then I think that changes how we view things.
I would just add that all these challenges that you just mentioned, they're all intertwined. They're not separate pieces. And again, looking back to youth homelessness in particular, you're most likely to become like homeless youth if you are non-LGBT, identify as LGBT, if you have had a history of domestic violence. In the district, you live in Ward 7 and 8, just across the river, you're more likely to become homeless. All these things cannot be addressed in that. And I think what's very unique about the past few months is that with this realization that, particularly with Black Lives Matter, it's important for us to begin to address how does that relate to all these other pieces. I think it creates a very powerful opportunity for a conversation. How does this impact communities in the spectrum? And these conversations should not be happening on that. It's important to face those difficult conversations, bring those people together from multiple perspectives, because we've made a lot of progress as individual groups. There's so much potential we can all work together for some common goal. And I think you mentioned the gospel. It's a beautiful way to actually unite people that have historically been separated, not only within the church, but across different communities that have so come together.
I had a question, and part of the question is because of my public narrative. I care particularly, I'm passionate about children having the ability to be children. And so that's where when I think about justice, that's where my mind naturally goes. Yet when we do primarily ministries with those who are experiencing homelessness, it tends to be centered and catered to those who are adult and obviously experiencing homelessness. And where you said, youth are trying to blend in, you don't necessarily, because sometimes they are in school, sometimes, they just blend and you don't know. And I was wondering, how can now I was able to connect with Sasha Bruce, which I think is unique, founded by Debbie Shore in 1974. How do we help folks recognize that ministry with teens who are experiencing homelessness, or even youth, these children who are in elementary school, even some of our foster kids, how do we help minister in a way that's filled with integrity? I mean, if you have any ideas about that, not to out anybody unnecessarily, but to make sure that your space is recognized as a space that welcomes, especially those young people who are experiencing homelessness.
It's a great question. And I think you are beginning that process by recognizing that youth homelessness is very different than adults. And that's something that Sasha Bruce has really advocated and recognized. The unique challenges that youth, and I'm saying youth all the way up to 24 years old, because we might want to say that you turn 18, you're an adult, you have your life figured out. That's not the truth. What's important about working with particularly homeless youth is creating that trust, that safe space. It is very different than providing a simple meal, making sure that when you engage with youth, you should not engaging as I'm going to save you, I'm going to tell you what to do, but rather I am here as your partner. I believe that you have the potential to be who you are. And there are certain barriers that keep you from being simply a child. I think what's very important when you minister is creating that safe space where they begin to feel comfortable. And to understand that, you have to look back. For most of these youth, they did not choose to be homeless. They found themselves in a circumstance that pushed them into homelessness. And oftentimes it was that violence, it was that distrust, unaccepting environment. And that has forced them to essentially grow up way too quickly. That childhood that they could have really thrived and really figured themselves out is no longer there. So when you create that safe space, begin to build that trust, you will naturally see the youth begin to be you, children, and begin to open up to you and actually asking for the support. At Sasha Bruce, that's exactly our philosophy. And that's our philosophy behind our drop-in centers, our street outreach. Our youth will come to us. We do not care whether you're under influence of the drug. We do not care whether you were recently homeless. On a campus, we don't anything you feel ashamed of. Our goal is to be there for you, and when you are ready, you feel comfortable, then we will be there for you. But other than that, we try to just continue to foster that environment. You cannot address housing, you cannot address workforce development, you cannot address health unless you have trust. And I think that's really critical administration.
I think, again, the message of the gospel is all about relationship. How are we in relationship with other people? And I think from my experience, there was a part of Seattle called Broadway, or it's kind of like the neighborhood or whatever, and then we would hang out there, and there was outreach workers actually who would come on a regular basis. Even before I was kicked out, I had a relationship with them. Like, they bring their dogs and they pass out condoms and whatever. They were just great, fun people who enjoy, building relationships. And so when I became homeless and was sleeping there, then they, came to talk to me, and they already knew me. And they're like, how's it going? And then I was comfortable enough with them. So it wasn't like I was talking to a stranger to tell them about the situation. And they could connect me with a place where I could stay. So I didn't have to be there any longer. And I think they also connected me. Like, once I had a place to stay, then I went back to school. And the school that I went to had a lot of students who were in either homeless or like marginally housed type situation. And they also had a good support network. And so I think, again, it comes down to relationships. And I think the one thing I'll say about church was, I think at that integrity service, the adults that were there didn't always know how to build those relationships with me. And I was the only person who was probably like 35. And at the time I was like 16 or whatever. But like, I think had they known how to do that better, I think I would have been comfortable telling them my story as well. But I think that just wasn't, I don't think we know how to do that necessarily. And for sometimes I think we're so afraid of like violating safe church or whatever, that can be I think that can put it's hard for people to build relationships because they're afraid that people are trying to engage or talk to them for the wrong reasons rather than recognizing it. And I don't know how to do that necessarily. I don't know how to advice about that. I just know, like, I think if people just talk to me and sat down and talk to me, how's it going or whatever. The other thing that I will say is that we might not think about how it impacts is after church, they would all go to dinner somewhere. As a homeless person, I had no money. I can't go to dinner. And I did get invited, but I didn't know how to say I can't go because I don't have I don't know how to say that. It would have been different if somebody said, hey, would you want to go as my treat or something? That would have been a way that I could have gone. Could have been the other thing that I think was helpful, or that I noticed sometimes, is how are you making things that people don't always have access to available? So like bathrooms and food. Yes. And at some of the churches I've worked with, after church, there's always food there. It's there for everybody, but some people that might be the only bathrooms that they have. And I remember one day something happened. We had to close a church, and there was a person who, I'm sure we are her bathroom every morning. She came to church like an hour. And when that was closed, she didn't have it. Thinking about it.
I have a question from our colleagues here online, and you brought it up, Shaniqua, a little bit, but the public education system is, well, public education has many challenges, but particularly around our students who are experiencing homelessness and specifically our LGBTQTI siblings, that they don't, the teens prefer that the educators not report because the system continues to fail the students and further, well, criminalizes, I'm adding, dehumanizes, makes it worse. So, but educators are bound for mandatory reporting. How, are there ways, well, what do we do about, are there ways to address any of these challenges that make sense, that makes sense for the church? Particular, and people say, well, maybe the church isn't involved, or the church isn't political, and you've got to go to your city council. But if the educators are in your pews and are conflicted, and the schools are in the neighborhoods in which your churches are located, this is your issue. I just want to say that. That was.
Being homeless is not a crime. It should never be a crime. We make all sorts of things crimes that ancillarily affect both, right? And I think, at least in my situation, getting kicked out wasn't like, nobody called CPS. If I had gotten, I came to school with a black eye, that was a different story. That was what triggered the call to CPS. I think it was mostly about connecting people to resources rather than connecting me to resources. And later, I should say, I worked with homeless youth, which is actually the group of people who gave me the nickname Shaniqua, which I love that name.
Yeah.
And so I think, how are we connecting folks to resources rather than, I've never had usually, and the other thing I would say is I knew, and most other youth know, that there are certain things that you say, and then that's going to trigger this call. And so they sometimes won't share that, or they will tell you roundabout and be like, my friend, and they'll do it that way.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point that homelessness is not a crime. What we have found at Social Groups is that it's important to educate the teachers about the resources and the ways that they can access, particularly our services. We have great relationships with mental liaisons, which work with homeless individuals who they know are in the school system. What we try to do at Social Groups is make ourselves aware in a way that is not associated with homelessness. So a good example is here in the District of Columbia, Ward 7 and 8, we've expanded our team outreach program, which is focused on civic engagement, healthy lifestyles, and just engagement in general. We never address it as a homeless youth program, but it is a powerful tool to connect the youth that might feel like they need those resources back to Social Groups in a way that does not feel like I need to identify myself to a teacher, to all other people. And if I go back to what I've been saying, it's about building that trust. You generally do not feel trustful about going to city agencies. And that is the biggest challenge we face when they come to us. It is breaking that hesitation, making them feel comfortable that if they engage with us, we're not going to report them to child protection services, law enforcement, or whatever. We are there for them. And I think as teachers and as you minister, it's again reinforcing that trust that you are there as a partner. You've mentioned your own experiences as homeless youth. I don't think I mentioned this, but most of my life I spent as a homeless. And I made it a point to never tell anybody. There were maybe one or two teachers that knew about it. But the way that I accessed resources was actually through a church. It was right next to the school. They would open up during lunch. No questions asked. Anybody could come in. But I was able to build this trust. great family that would take me in whenever I didn't have any. You do not have to say, come to us, this is a homeless youth services or whatever. Provide a meal to anybody. Provide a few game boards. Provide us something that engages them and start there. And people will naturally reach out to you. And that's probably the best thing that you can do.
Thank you for sharing that story, because I'm wondering, even as a church, how can we challenge ourselves? I think we're under the polite delusion that we are the progressive Episcopal Church. Been there, done that, solve the problem. But there have been some discussions we've had just early on this with UBE. We had a big discussion this past spring as our Black Episcopal group about ways in which we've neglected to lift up LGBTQI young leaders. And so I'm thinking about ways in which we can be called upon and challenged as church to not just help people survive, like help homeless, but be expected to help people thrive. I mean, you two are examples of folks who come from experiences of being homeless youth and now are like community leaders at like sort of a national level. But are there ways in which you would like point to church and say and challenge, command us? It's like there's a place of judgment comeuppance that like we don't need to just look for the lowest common denominator. Now we're feeding someone who's homeless, but like really saying like we're losing the capacity for incredible leadership if we don't help people thrive. Like are there ways in which we should be stepping into that space?
That's a great question. And I would say maybe the best way they can start tackling that is look at those organizations, look at those churches that are seen as the place to go for LGBTQ. And what you will notice is that they're usually not places where you receive services, they celebrate, they see you, they actually position them as the voice of that community. I think that's very important. And it goes back to what I mentioned earlier. Our role is not to save somebody or tell them what to do, but rather to be a partner and elevate their voice. And that's perhaps one of the most powerful things that you could do. These are individuals that have historically been marginalized. They have historically had their voices suppressed. You can actually empower them. Use your influence within the community to demonstrate there are amazing people here, and we are committed to seeing you thrive.
I'm thinking my experience growing up, and so my grandpa was a priest on the reservation, and some of the like he had this very philosophy about, well, one, I should tell you, in Lakota the word for child literally means sacred one. It means like, yeah, sacred one. It's the same word we use for sacred. And like when kids would, kids might be playing and they'll run up on the chancel and like they'll run around the altar and stuff. The mom like flips out like, yeah, and my grandpa's like, no, this should be a place where they can feel comfortable, where they can explore. And so he would never like, freak out about it. And then they did get comfortable. I might have been one of those kids. And I actually used to think I was an electrolyte, not an acolyte. Whole nother story for another time. But I think, how do you learn and grow into that? And I think he would often encourage the youth to do things. Like it wasn't like this was something that you would do later. It was always like, how are you engaged in this? And maybe I misread some of the words when I did the readings, but it was important that I was. And I think we have to think about how are we incorporating folks into that and not seeing them as this token thing that they're doing, but actually this is their role. They are called to do. And the thing that I always used to be frustrated hearing is people are like, you are the future. We're not the future, we're the present. And both because we're here now, but also because we are a gift to the church and to the world, again, because of the sacred, you are sacred. And so how are we being pushed slightly, like the Holy Spirit does, push us out of our comfort zone, both us being okay with youth and young folks doing things and not freaking out that they're going to do it right or whatever, because sometimes that's how new things happen, right? But also, how are we pushing them out of their comfort zone? Like if you knew me when I was young, I was so terrified and scared to talk to people and talk to anybody. I'd be like sweating bullets sitting up here. And it's because I think I was given those opportunities and someone's like, hey, you need to try and sing that song. Or, hey, you need to try to. The other thing I think that was really important, because of that sacred role that we have did knew about that I was Winkday, and they introduced me to all of the Winkday in our community. Without telling me that that's who those people were, they made sure I knew the curator of our museum. They made sure I knew one of our medicine people, healers in our community, and saw the work they did, saw how they lived their life, saw how they live their life in a sacred way, saw how the community valued them. A doctor that worked on our reservation. And so that when I came in, as opposed to coming out, right? You're coming into your community in this role, called to serve your community as this healer and reconciler. When that happened, then they could point to those people and say, remember when I introduced you to Florentine? Or remember when I remember when you met these people? You can see how they do that. We are calling on you, and you're going to be lifted up.
Just like that. Isn't flexibility the best? Start with optimum flexibility.
Are there other questions? I wanted. Oh, thanks, Liz. And this is, I guess it's a theological question. I shared with Shaniqua earlier that when I was calling some of our LGBT siblings in the church, I said, I'd like to invite you to do this panel to speak to the caucus, and if you have any concerns that we can create a resolution to take to general convention. And more than once I heard, well, I'm not sure what the issues are. And Shaniqua addressed this, but primarily the issues that we fought for were marriage equality and ordination. And we have those. So what are the issues? Currently, there's a conversation in integrity. So you mentioned integrity, but I don't know that we're having regular integrity services as we did back in, the 90s. So, but we also have, we can see the numbers. Trans young people are dying. We have trans folks in the church. I had someone, we were talking about baptism. They wanted to be baptized in their name. And so that's a theological conversation. We don't have a right for that. Or do we?
We have a right for rename in our.
That's new though, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was.
Renaming.
Yeah.
And so, and again, I also am challenged, I was challenged in finding younger than 50. Well, because one, it's the middle of the day and young people can't quite get here. But I think there's still challenges that we face, but we don't want to name them. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that. Either one of you.
I won't say that I know what the issues are. I know what I think issues are for me. And I think one of them that I talked about was the idea of decolonizing gender and sexuality. And I think so often what I find, I'm kind of getting off topic here, but the Episcopal Church was designed by white folks, which were very individualistic. And our prayer book is full of individualistic theology. But Christianity was a collectivistic, it came from a collectivistic culture. And so it's missing a whole piece of things here. And we can't always see that. And for me, anytime I think there's something missing, like for example, the renaming right, had they asked an Indian person, they'd be like, of course we have all sorts of naming ceremonies. And of course people get multiple names. In some cultures, they actually name people as you age, like they have a child name, adolescent name, adult name, and an elder name. And those you are expected to change your name as you get older. And so of course we could adopt something, not misappropriate, but we could come up with something that could work in this idea for the church. And of course in the Bible, but there's tons of times people change their names, right. And so I think.
So it need not have been this long, elongated conversation at convention, right?
And I think we don't look. We have this thing that we think this is the only way we can think. We don't look to our siblings from other cultures, other communities, other ways of thinking, And I think if we did that more often, we could see the entire breadth of the expression of our church and our faith and our spirituality. And there's so much that we could look to our LGBT siblings to, for example, creative community or how we see our families, or all these different things that I think we could learn from that we don't always. In that decolonizing of gender and sexuality, we have to rethink how are we thinking about pronouns, for example, which I think some people laugh at when we ask people, to say your pronouns, which in Lakota, we actually don't have pronouns in our language. That's kind of interesting. But anyway, I won't get into that. And then, but we have to rethink how we do those things. We have to rethink how we think about like sexuality. In Lakota culture, weekday is actually like a spiritual and social role. And yes, most of us were what people would call gay now, but we didn't think of it that way. But I think this Western idea, Victorian ideas of sexuality, where we're so focused on who's doing what with their parts, rather than actually just how somebody is a person and maybe what special and unique gifts that person has, I think we sort of missed all of that. And that's what I'm gonna say.
I cannot add to that. I think that captured really looking at a community and seeing how they celebrate as a community, recognize the diverse background that the church really has. I would say that what's unique about the church is that you were the leader in this area. Far before any of the churches began to tackle this, you were the leader and you've accomplished this. And when others see the church, they see us that part. The church that can really help address and provide the path forward for some of the challenges that they might be facing. And I think what you very important to mention, looking to our diverse communities, how can we use that to inform our policy forward. I think that's very critical. And the other piece that I would encourage us to think about is the role of youth. You mentioned that our youth are our future, but they're also the present. It's very true. How can we create a more embracing celebratory environment where they can really continue to carry these efforts forward? Unfortunately, many of our churches are getting older. And I cannot really understand kind of what that is. But again, it's bringing back those individuals, providing them with that safe space where they see themselves as part of it. And I think that will be critical for the next few years.
So I think there's this idea that we have somewhere, not sure where it comes from, but that we always have to be guardians of the faith, like the gatekeeper idea. And I think that prevents so much innovation and change. And really, what does it say about our theology as Christians? And what does it say about the God we believe in when we want to do the same thing all the time? And our hymnal is the same hymns or what, whatever. So like if we believe in a God that is constantly present and changing and renewing and all of those things, then our liturgies and our hymnody and all of those things should be changing and transforming also. And I think one of the things, the gifts that I think young people and the diversity of our church bring are these new ideas. And I think so often when we bring them, the reaction, oh, wow, we've either never done that way, or what is that going to say about this thing? Or, how can we possibly sing something that's not in our 1982 hymnal or whatever? Like those, we need to kind of think about what this might look like and how those things. And I think that's one of the gifts that our LGBT siblings give us a lot of is this new idea. And because for so long, the church has said, you don't belong here, and other people have said you don't fit into our box, we have had to sort of lift up and create things on our own. And so we can do that. And we look to that example, I think. And for that matter, people of color have also been focused on that. But I think the white Jesus that's on too many of these churches has made our church blind to the black and brown faces, and they cannot see Christ in those black and brown faces because they only see the white Jesus in their church.
Amen.
Well, Shaniqua just started preaching.
Shaniqua, that was it. Shaniqua, oh my goodness.
Amen. Shaniqua, amen.
You got an amen corner. All right, Hazel.
Cool. There's so much richness here, and I just want to lift up because it can feel often in the pursuit of equity and justice that we have to try on all these new frameworks and do something, these were the tangibles. And of course, there are plenty of things that we need to change because Lord have mercy. And what I heard you say, especially Rico, right, is that sometimes to address inequity, we have to create the conditions for people to thrive. Give them some food, help them feel safe, make sure education is worth a damn, excuse my French, but and I think those are the things as the church, we do want to be creating platforms and programs and building relationships that help us shift. And also we want to pay attention to the ways that we don't necessarily need to recreate stuff. Sometimes it's really kind of going where the energy is and following the lead of our young people, redefining leadership, which isn't about how can I hold the mantle for as long as possible, but about enabling others to achieve their own purpose in this time. And so I'm so grateful that that's what I got. I don't know what y'all got, but that's what I got from hearing the two of you share so beautifully. And I hope that we are all encouraged to really shift our theologies, to shift our practices, to deepen this work and to center the voices that are not at the table. Again, going back to what Dawn said, who's not at the table and how to the conversation. Well, we're so grateful. Thank you so much, Nicola. Thank you so much, Rika, for being here and sharing so much with us. I hope you will join us for lunch. Yes.
That's their clapping.
Zoom's clapping. We are getting ready to have lunch. Is there anything you want to say, Diane, by way?
Well, can I disconnect Zoom? If
Yeah.
you all can disconnect, and then you should have received via email the link for the service tonight. And I'll just let you know, if you were thinking about not worshiping with us tonight, that was the wrong choice. The best choice is to come and worship with us tonight at 7 p.m. Thank you so much. And I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye to you all.
Thank you very much. Goodbye. We'll see you in a little while. Thank you.
Thank you, 7 p.m. And we start worship on time at Epiphany. So
That's
Father
right.
Ron, be there at 7.
Be there, be square. I got it. Have a good lunch. Thank you.
Thanks, Glenna.